After a fatal collision, the SS Columbia rapidly sank in the dense fog of San Francisco Bay, with only a handful of passengers and crew managing to escape amidst the chaos. What secrets lie behind this disaster? Dive into history's mysteries with us. Subscribe now for the untold stories of SS Columbia. Water is coming into my room. Miller, we are coming, save your batteries. Robinson, all right, but keep talking to me so we will know you are coming. That was the last message received from the Princess Sophia at 5:20 on October 25. The Cedar desperately searched the area, but the stranded liner was nowhere to be found in the stormy darkness. What exactly happened in the Sophia's final moments is unknown, but it's clear that she came to a quick and violent end. Watches recovered from her victims all stopped at 5:50 p.m., marking the time they were thrown into the sea. Not a single person on board the Princess Sophia survived. The only survivor was an English setter found in Ork Bay, outside Juneau. It's believed that as the tide rose, the ship became partially buoyant, causing her to violently shift over the rocks in the heavy surf, ripping open her hull before washing her off the reef, where she quickly foundered. But many mysteries remain. Robinson's first SOS message was received almost a full hour before the watches on victims stopped, suggesting that the whole ordeal lasted around an hour. While most victims were wearing life preservers, the bodies of over 100 victims were found still in their cabins. All 8 of her steel-hulled lifeboats went down with the ship. In the icy water, victims would survive only minutes before succumbing to hypothermia. The next day, the storm died down considerably as the Cedar and other rescue vessels combed the area. As they reached the site, they found just the Princess Sophia's foremast sticking out of the water. They spent the next 3 hours searching for survivors, but they only found bodies. Hundreds of bodies, floating in the water. The Princess Sophia was the deadliest maritime accident in the history of British Columbia and Alaska, but news of the horrifying disaster was soon drowned out by mounting panic over the rapidly spreading Spanish flu and the elated celebrations of the armistice, signed only a couple of weeks later. With no survivors and larger world events to focus on, the Princess Sophia and her victims soon faded from memory. What we know of what happened on board during those final hours come from her wireless messages and letters found on the bodies of her victims, who wrote to loved ones, some expressing frustration that their travel was delayed, others sending their somber last wishes, should the worst happen. We have no way of knowing what was passing through Captain Locke's mind during those critical hours after his vessel grounded. It can be assumed that he was well aware that the decision to evacuate could put his passengers in more danger. He had no way of knowing that those few early hours of calm weather were the best window of opportunity he would get. And while it was possible in those hours to mount an evacuation, the steel lifeboats weighed more than a ton each, and would have to be lifted off the rocks and into the water. Another potential explanation for his dissension came from Captain Ledbetter, who reported a rising barometer. Captain Locke surely would have been monitoring his own barometer and likely assumed that the weather would soon improve. As he looked out the waves, crashing violently on the rocks below, his mind no doubt went to the Clallam disaster, with lifeboats crashing into the sea, hurling helpless women and children to their deaths. His hope and confidence in his ship told him salvation was only moments away. Unfortunately, he was wrong. His caution squandered his only window of opportunity, sealing the fate of everyone on board. In the days before modern navigation equipment, a ship lost in a fog bank was essentially sailing blind with little more to rely on than a captain's skill. Dead reckoning, an imperfect method of navigation that measured how far a ship has traveled from a fixed point, often led vessels miles off course, and could do nothing to anticipate what lay hidden in the fog. To avoid a potentially deadly collision, ships relied on their fog horns, blown at regular intervals at all hours, to warn nearby ship traffic. During the summer months from June to October, dense fog banks are a common occurrence along the Pacific coastline of the United States, and caused Norsis wrecks at the beginning of the 20th century. Fierce competition between the steamship companies that operated between major cities in California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska put enormous pressure on steamship captains. Many of these companies were operated by railroads, which were accustomed to maintaining a strict schedule, no matter the conditions. But these customs were poorly suited for the treacherous and unpredictable waters of the wild Pacific Ocean. When the swirling mist of a looming fog bank rolled in, captains often maintained a high speed, their foghorn blaring, hoping that no danger loomed in the fog. Before we get into things, I want to take just a brief moment to talk about this video's sponsor, Ground News. Researching historic events quickly teaches you that a story can change wildly depending on who's telling it. Every media outlet, even those from back at turn of the century, has some type of bias that impacts how they cover a story. Because of that, I find it best to survey a variety of sources to get the full picture when doing research, and when I'm reading about what's going on today. That's why I love using Ground News. Ground News is an app that helps you easily compare news coverage by aggregating multiple news sources in one place. They give media outlets a bias rating that tells you if the source is left or right-leaning or centrist, so you can get a good idea of how a topic is being covered from all ends of the political spectrum. And if you're short on time, you can use Ground News to show you headlines from multiple outlets, or if you want to read something more in-depth, you can easily read full articles. It's a great way to stay on top of the news. I wish I had this for news on 20th century shipwrecks. If you watch this channel a lot, you know that I value seeing things from multiple perspectives. That can be daunting these days, but Ground News makes it easier to stay informed. To compare news coverage from around the world, across the political spectrum, check out Ground News by visiting Ground News Biggleboats or click on the link in the description below. Thank you so much to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Now back to the story of the SS Columbia. On December 31, 1879, in Menlo Park, New Jersey, Thomas Edison unveiled his most famous invention, the carbon filament light bulb. While others had already stumbled upon this invention, Edison's New Year's Eve display of his incandescent light bulb was the first to capture the public's imagination. He famously proclaimed that he will make electricity so cheap that only the rich will burn candles. One of those attending this event was Henry Villard, the president of the Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company. Like pretty much everyone else, Villard thought this newfangled electric light was pretty darn cool, and he immediately requested that Edison install his electric lighting system on his company's newest steamer, the SS Columbia. That same year, the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company bought and merged with the Oregon Steamship Company, explained their steamship routes. To operate these new routes, a state-of-the-art steamship was ordered in July 1879. Labeled hull number 193. This new ship was constructed at the John Roach & Sons Delaware River Iron Shipbuilding and Engine Works shipyard in Chester, Pennsylvania. Construction began in September 1879 and the ship was launched on February 24, 1880. Not trusting the new electrical equipment, John Roach refused to install the incandescent lighting system at his shipyard, fearing that it could spark a fire. So in spring of 1880, the Columbia was sailed to New York City where Edison and his team installed the system themselves. The lights were lit on May 2, 1880, the first commercial installation of Edison's new light bulb. The Columbia's owners were clearly interested in equipping their new steamship with the latest comforts and technology. She measured 309 feet in length with a beam of 38.5 feet and came in at 2,721 tons. She was equipped with 4 decks and powered by 6 coal-burning boilers that fed 2 compound condensing steam engines to power a single 16-foot diameter Hirsch 4-bladed propeller, achieving a 16-knot service speed, which was respectable for the time. A second auxiliary steam engine powered her eclectic lights. She was also equipped with a brigantine rig sail plan that could be rigged upon 2 iron masts. This was just before steam power was trusted enough to forego sails altogether. She could carry 382 passengers between her first class and steerage. Designed to service the San Francisco to Portland route, she was equipped with several safety features. She carried 8 metal lifeboats, 1 wooden lifeboat, and a wooden workboat, along with 5 life rafts and 537 life preservers. The Columbia sailed around Cape Horn to San Francisco in the summer of 1880, carrying a shipment of 13 locomotives and 200 railroad cars. Once in San Francisco, her original carbon paper filament bulbs were replaced by newer bulbs with bamboo filaments. Columbia's engineer sent a letter of satisfaction with the system to Edison, reporting that none of the lights gave out after 415 hours and 45 minutes on constant use. She arrived in Portland for the first time on August 28. Her electric lights were a great success, and soon other shipping companies had similar systems installed on their vessels, with Cunard's SS Servia being the first major transatlantic ocean liner fitted with incandescent light bulbs. The Columbia's owners and the traveling public were delighted with her, as she set out on a long and celebrated career. At the turn of the century, the Union Pacific Railroad took over the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company, and in 1904 the subsidiary changed its name to the San Francisco and Portland Steamship Company. For over 2 decades, the Columbia served her passengers and company well and carried a solid reputation for reliability. In July 1895, her original Edison generators were replaced by a more modern system. Her original dynamos were donated to the Smithsonian. By the early years of the 20th century, the iron-hulled Columbia was now outclassed by new steam vessels. But her owners still had faith in the old vessel, and she was regularly maintained and refitted. On April 18, 1906, while the Columbia was dry-docked at the Union Iron Works in San Francisco for a refit, the city was devastated by a massive earthquake. The violent shaking knocked the Columbia off of her supports and she rolled onto her side, puncturing her plates in 9 places and partially flooding her hull. Despite the damage, her owners were not ready to retire the old steamship, and over the course of 2 months, the holes were patched and water was pumped out. She was then transported to the dock at Hunters Point, where more extensive repairs could be made. She was nearly lost during transport when she encountered heavy seas. Her steam pipes burst and the crippled ship developed a heavy list. Thinking she was only moments away from an explosion, her crew hastily abandoned her. But she was soon recovered and towed to the dry dock, where she underwent extensive repairs. She was soon returned to service in January 1907. Aside from briefly getting stuck in pack ice on the Columbia River, the steamship Columbia finally resumed operating her regular route between San Francisco and Portland. While she was well past her prime, she continued to serve reliably, but her long and storied career would soon come to a sudden and violent end later that same year. As the sun rose over San Francisco on the morning of Saturday, July 20, 1907, the city found itself shrouded in a dense fog. If you're familiar with San Francisco, you know that this is typical weather for the city. For the 27-year-old SS Columbia, the fog was nothing more than an annoying inconvenience, as she prepared for another routine voyage to Portland, but it was dense enough that it delayed her 11 a.m. sailing, giving a handful of late-arriving passengers a chance to board the ship. The convention for the National Education Association recently wrapped up in Los Angeles, and many of the Columbia's passengers were schoolteachers. Lulu Hanson, a young teacher from Minneapolis, was touring the West Coast on her way home, as was Emma Grease, another young teacher from Cleveland. Other passengers came from all walks of life. Attilia Liedl taught music in San Francisco. She was traveling to Portland for vacation. Stella Cannon, her brother Louis, and their elderly mother were on their way to visit Stella's other brother. Maybelle Watson was the 16-year-old daughter of a prominent family in Berkeley, California. She was also heading to Portland to visit her brother. 20-year-old William J. Smith, the son of an Army contractor, was returning home to Vancouver, Washington after visiting friends in San Francisco. On this voyage, the Columbia carried 251 passengers and crew. She was commanded by Captain Peter Doran. The fog over San Francisco soon broke to reveal a pleasant summer day. The Columbia left about an hour after her scheduled departure time and sailed north for the mouth of the Columbia River in Oregon. Several passengers, including Lulu Hansen, spent the first few hours of the voyage on deck, enjoying the beautiful weather and the scenery of the California coast. But as the Columbia passed Point Reyes, a swell gradually developed. As the ship rocked from side to side, Lulu and many other passengers began to experience seasickness, and many retired to their cabins early. As the sun set, a heavy fog bank soon enveloped the ship. Captain Doran, who had only just retired to his cabin for the evening, returned to the bridge to guide his vessel. While these conditions were difficult, they were typical for the Northern California coast, and Captain Doran maintained the Columbia's high speed, eager to make up the time lost from their delayed departure. He was joined on the bridge by Quartermaster J. Ellis and Second Officer Richard A. Drupp. Just past midnight, approximately 12 miles off Shelter Cove, Lookout S.G. Peterson stood tense at his station as he peered into the darkness. The fog was so thick that he could only see approximately 2 ship lengths ahead of them. As was customary for these conditions, the Columbia sounded her fog whistle at regular intervals as she sailed blindly through the night. Not long into his watch, right after the Columbia's fog whistle cut through the night, Peterson thought he heard the whistle of another ship answer back. Soon Captain Doran and Second Officer A. Drupp also heard the whistle, but the captain did not order his engine room to reduce their speed. Over the next 15 minutes, the Columbia continued on, with the whistle of the mystery ship ringing out every 60 seconds, growing louder with each blast. Still, Captain Doran maintained his speed. Then A. Drupp spotted the lights of another ship about 2 points off their starboard bow. Captain Doran ordered 2 blasts from their whistle to signal their passing, but it was too late. The oncoming ship let out 1 whistle, followed by several short blasts, the signal for danger. At 5 o'clock on Saturday, July 20, 1907, the 457-ton steam schooner San Pedro departed Eureka, California, loaded with 390,000 feet of redwood destined for San Pedro, California. At midnight, First Officer Ben Hendrickson took charge, as they sailed south through the heavy fog. Like Captain Doran, Hendrickson also chose not to reduce their speed despite the low visibility. At around 12:15 a.m., Lookout E. Soderberg shouted that he heard a faint fog whistle off their port bow. While Hendrickson didn't hear the whistle himself, he ordered a change in course, taking them further out to sea to avoid the passing traffic. He never ordered his ship to slow down as the minutes passed and the whistle of the other ship answered their own, louder and louder, until suddenly the mass of the Columbia appeared from the fog off the port bow, nearly on top of them. Hendrickson ordered his engines stopped and let out a warning signal. At the same time, Captain Doran ordered the Columbia's engines reversed in a desperate ploy to avoid collision, but it was too late. The bow of the San Pedro slammed into the Columbia at 12:22 a.m. Doran shouted at the San Pedro, "What are you doing, man?" as his engines reversed, pulling the 2 ships apart. The San Pedro was badly damaged. Roused by the impact, Captain Magnus Hansen climbed forward just in time to see the gaping hole in the Columbia's side as the ships separated. At about 6 yards apart, the Columbia disappeared in the fog. It seemed that despite the damage, the San Pedro would just barely remain afloat, aided by the buoyant lumber in her cargo holds. Captain Hansen ordered his 3 small lifeboats lowered to pick up survivors, because it was immediately clear that the large passenger ship was doomed. On the Columbia, Captain Doran ordered Second Officer A. Drupp to prepare the lifeboats, while he went forward to inspect the damage. Earlier that evening, passenger William Smith spent most of the night visiting Chief Engineer John F. Jackson in his cabin. He recalled that the night was especially cold and dark. As he returned to his cabin at around midnight, he could see nothing but the swirling fog in the soft glow of the ship's lights. Only moments after he began preparing for bed, he heard the exchange of fog whistles and realized something terrible was happening. He ran on deck just in time to see the San Pedro collide with the ship and then disappear into the fog. The collision felt to him like a long, soft grind, hardly enough to wake most of the sleeping passengers. Immediately realizing the severity of the situation, Smith ran back to the passenger cabins. He ran up and down the hall, pounding and kicking on doors, desperately trying to rouse the sleeping passengers, who had only minutes to escape the now sinking ship. Attilia Liedelt, whose cabin was closer to the collision, had trouble sleeping due to her seasickness. She described a much more violent collision that immediately got her out of bed, certain that what she felt was a critical death blow to the ship. Chief Engineer Jackson, who just bid good night to Smith, was laying in his berth at the time, just dozing off when he felt the dull shock. He dressed quickly and raced to the engine room to assess the situation. He found the room dry, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He warned First Assistant Engineer M.C. Burpee, who was on watch at the time, not to let himself or the other crew get caught below. Jackson then raced up to the bridge to find out how bad the situation was. But as he reached the hurricane deck, he heard the stern voice of the captain ordering everyone to the boats. When Attilia reached the deck, she found nothing but confusion, as no one seemed to know what to do. There was a strange but brief moment of calm immediately after the collision that lulled some into a false sense of security. A few tried to return to their staterooms, but were stopped by the crew. Then, the vessel suddenly lurched considerably to starboard, igniting panic for the passengers still below deck, only just waking up, many of them still seasick. In the confusion, several passengers searched desperately for their life preservers, which were stowed in their cabins. William Smith did his best to help other passengers put these on. He recalled one family, a mother, a father, and their 3 children. After helping them get their life preservers on, William left to help others. He last saw them holding hands in their cabin. He later learned that the entire family was lost. As Lulu Hansen reached the top deck, she found a scene of utter chaos. She saw the captain doing his best to calm passengers, telling them to follow orders and they will be safe. Lulu recalled that he was the only cool-headed person on the ship. Once the order was given to head to the boats, Chief Engineer Jackson returned to his cabin to grab his life preserver, but found that it was gone. Someone else must have already taken it. He then raced to the engine room, now rapidly filling with water. He called down into the darkness, but received no reply. With nothing left to do, he headed to his assigned lifeboat, number 4. By now the Columbia was turning over so quickly that Jackson had to cut the small boat from the falls, and it was able to float free without lowering. Attilia found herself at the Columbia's stern, with the ship sinking so fast by the bow that only 7 minutes after hearing the collision, she was now perched high above the waves on the ship, only moments from its final plunge. In a major stroke of luck, Attilia saw one of the ship's life rafts floating empty right below her. She instinctively jumped down, injuring her hip, but landing safely in the raft. Another woman who followed her wasn't so lucky, and Attilia watched as she jumped and quickly disappeared in the black water some distance from her raft. Soon others were able to climb into the raft, which drifted near the Columbia's bridge, now quickly submerging. From their vantage point, they could see Captain Doran, still at his station, bracing himself at the rail, blasting the ship's whistle. As he was taken by the waves, he extended both hands and appeared to say goodbye. The ship's ringing whistle seemed to die with him. In the pandemonium, Stella Cannon, her brother Louis, and their mother had only moments to react to the collision. Almost as soon as they secured their life preservers and made their way on deck, the ship's final plunge was already beginning. Already exhausted, Stella's elderly mother sat on a bench at the stern. The family was separated as the ship dropped from beneath them and seemed to explode just beneath the water. Some thought that this was a boiler explosion, but it was more likely caused by collapsing air pockets deep within the ship. The violent blast fractured Stella's thumb and 2 ribs, but she was soon picked up by Chief Engineer Jackson's boat. She could hear her brother's screams in the darkness and begged Jackson to row in his direction, but Jackson refused, fearing that the debris, still shooting up from the wreck, would damage and sink the overloaded lifeboat. Fortunately, Louis was picked up by another boat, but their mother was lost. As the ship dropped, Lulu Hansen desperately searched for a boat, but she could only find one still covered and lashed to the deck. Almost in an instant, she was thrown into the sea as the Columbia lurched to starboard. Fortunately, wearing a life preserver, Lulu was soon picked up by Third Officer Hawes's boat. William Smith also found himself thrown into the frigid sea. In the chaos, he saw the San Pedro's mast light, just barely visible in the darkness. He instinctively swam for the light, almost impossibly far away. Somehow he soon reached the safety of the other ship, fortunate that he was a strong swimmer. The San Pedro also picked up Attilia's raft and several others. The small ship's deck was now barely above the waterline. Maybelle Watson was able to find a place in a crowded lifeboat, one of only a few actually launched from the starboard side of the ship. But overloaded, the small craft was unable to clear the Columbia before she was sucked under. Maybelle was pulled to the surface by her life preserver. She found herself surrounded by other people in the water. Then, she saw another young woman, schoolteacher Emma Grease, struggling and shouting for help. Emma's life preserver was strapped on backward, forcing her head under the water. Maybelle immediately swam over to Emma and used every ounce of strength she had to help keep her head above the water, saving her life. The two women were soon picked up by Third Officer Hawes's lifeboat. Despite other people nearby, 16-year-old Maybelle was the only one who was willing to help Emma, and she was rightfully hailed as a hero following the disaster. Soon other ships arrived on the scene to rescue survivors and relieve the San Pedro, which now refused to take on anyone else, fearing that they were only moments away from foundering themselves. Following the collision, the Columbia dropped like a stone, sinking in just around 8 or 9 minutes. Of the 251 passengers and crew on board, 88 lost their lives. The disaster shocked the West Coast. Coming on the heels of the high-profile sinkings of the city of Rio de Janeiro, the Clallam, and the Valencia, the public demanded answers. Like so many disasters, the Columbia tragedy came with a series of random decisions and coincidences that would prove fateful. When Rose Anderson, a restaurant worker who was headed to Seattle via Portland, arrived at the wharf, she exchanged her ticket at the last minute with a young school teacher who couldn't get a ticket in time for the Columbia. Rose thought little of it since she was in less of a hurry than the teacher. She never caught the young woman's name and never knew if she survived the sinking. Rowena and Ruby Cooper were school teachers from Fayette, Missouri, touring the Pacific coast. Ruby was afraid of trains, so the two decided to take the Columbia to Portland. When the ship sank, Ruby survived, but her sister Rowena drowned. Ruby later told a reporter that she would rather have sunk with her sister. Assistant engineer Al Robertson learned, just before the Columbia's final voyage, that he was accepted to join the San Francisco Fire Department. At the last minute, he exchanged his position on the ship with another young man named Max Claus. Max would lose his life in the sinking. It seems that those in the engine room failed to heed Chief Engineer Jackson's warning and stayed below too long. As Grace and Effie Keller of Decatur, Illinois rushed to the Spear Street wharf to catch the Columbia, they were sure that they'd missed her, arriving a few minutes past her 11 a.m. departure time. They were meeting their mother G.A. Keller and their sister Alma, who was also running late. The Columbia's delayed departure felt like a stroke of luck. All 4 women died in the tragedy. With so many wrecked passenger ships, public outrage at the steamship companies in the area was reaching a fever pitch. No one could understand how the Columbia could sink so rapidly. While she was old, she was known to be reliable. She was equipped with 4 watertight compartments and had just passed a routine inspection a few months prior, certifying that she met all safety regulations at the time. Investigators determined that the Columbia's iron hull had grown brittle with age and cracked after bearing the full brunt of the collision, creating a 7-foot gash. While she had 4 watertight compartments, much like the Titanic, they did not extend the full height of her hull. This helps explain why the ship initially seemed sound. At first, the flooding impacted only one compartment, but once it spilled over into the next, it took the old ship down in an instant. Captain Doran and First Officer Hendrickson of the San Pedro were found to bear most of the responsibility for the accident. Captain Doran's decisive actions and cool demeanor after the collision and his going down with his ship left his reputation somewhat untarnished. But the crew of the San Pedro faced a harsher judgment. Hendrickson's license was suspended for 5 years. It was also determined that Captain Hansen issued insufficient orders and neglected his duties by being absent from the bridge while navigating in low visibility. The survivors, however, mostly praised the crews of both ships for their actions after the collision for doing everything they could to save as many lives as possible. The San Pedro nearly sank herself, while her crew pulled survivors from the water. At just under 10 minutes, the 4th chapter of this video, describing the events of the sinking, is longer than the time it took the Columbia to go under following the collision. 8 minutes is an incredibly fast rate of sinking for a 2,721-ton ship. It's an absolute nightmare scenario. What was once a technological marvel became a death trap. If it wasn't for the heroism of the Columbia's crew, and passengers like William Smith and Mabel Watson, many more would have lost their lives. It's a lesson that when technology fails us, we are often left on our own to watch out for each other. On the morning of Friday, February 22, 1901, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the city of San Francisco awoke to another day of dense fog. In those days when the fog rolled in, as it so often does in the Bay Area, ships would drop anchor at the mouth of Golden Gate and wait for the fog to clear. At the Fort Point Barracks, Private Harry Taylor had drawn the early morning sentry duty. As he paced the wall perimeter of the old fort, sometime after 5:30, he thought he heard something in the darkness. He walked to the edge and listened. From somewhere deep in the fog he heard a strained, gurgling steam whistle. It was like no other whistle he had ever heard on the bay. As the strange whistle faded, it was replaced by a faint cacophony of screams echoing over the water. Meanwhile, at the Fort Point Life-Saving Station, Lookout Mark Ellingson was situated in the station's tower, a position that placed him on an island above the fog. Just after 5:30, he heard whistles and shouts somewhere in the darkness. He could have picked up the phone and called in an alarm. But instead, he did nothing. The whistles stopped and soon the morning was quiet again, as daylight approached. At 7:20, Ellingson saw a lifeboat emerge from the clearing fog. It wasn't until that moment, 2 hours too late, that he realized that a major tragedy just occurred in the fog at Golden Gate. In the 1870s, the American industrialist John Roach owned the largest shipbuilding firm in the United States, producing more tonnage at his shipyard in Chester, Pennsylvania, than the next 2 largest firms combined. Roach dreamed of transforming his shipyard into a vast global transportation empire, and he saw an opportunity in the Brazilian import market. At the time, trade with Brazil was dominated by British shipping companies in what was known as the Triangle Trade that sent ships from Britain to Brazil, the US, and then back to Britain. Hoping to break the monopoly, John Roach established the United States and Brazil Mail Steamship Company in 1876. 2 steamships were commissioned to operate the new venture. The city of Para and the city of Rio de Janeiro, which was launched on March 6, 1878. Despite President Rutherford B. Hayes and many members of Congress attending the launches, both the U.S. and Brazilian governments ultimately rejected Roach's requests for subsidies. The venture quickly proved unprofitable and folded after only 2 years of operation. Roach's shipyard never recovered from the financial loss and went out of business in 1885. The city of Rio and her sister ship were soon sold to the Pacific Mail Steamship Company in 1881 and were refitted for a new career on the Pacific, traveling between San Francisco, Hawaii, Japan, and Hong Kong. The iron-hulled city of Rio was one of the largest ships in the company's fleet, coming in 4,548 tons and measuring 370 feet, or 113 meters in length, with a beam of 39 feet, or 12 meters. She was driven by a single screw, powered by a compound steam engine fed by 6 boilers. She was equipped with a barquentine rig sail plan for auxiliary power. She quickly became a workhorse for the company and proved popular with passengers, but her 20 years on the Pacific weren't without incident. In 1893, Alfred Daniel Jones, the Consul General of the United States in Shanghai, booked passage on the ship to return to the U.S. for treatment after suffering from mental health issues. Soon after the ship's departure, he became violent and had to be restrained in his cabin. He reportedly raved incessantly for 7 days before dying on board on December 9, 1893. The strangeness of this unsettling incident is compounded by the poor understanding of mental health at the time and sensationalized press reports that make it difficult to know what actually happened. In 1895, the ship struck a reef in Nagasaki. The damage was so severe that she had to be beached to prevent her from sinking completely. She was soon refloated and repaired. In 1897, she encountered a massive typhoon between Japan and Hawaii. She fought the storm for 12 days and burned through all of her coal before she could reach port. Her topmasts, deckhouses, and furniture were broken up and burned to generate enough power to complete her voyage. Again, the damage was repaired and she was returned to service. She was leased as a troopship in 1898 during the Spanish-American War to transport troops to Manila, and carried up to 1,000 troops per voyage on what must have been some incredibly claustrophobic passages. In 1900 she was returned to passenger service and quickly collided with a ship called the Bombay in Hong Kong on August 5, 1900. Once again, she was quickly repaired and returned to service. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company often purchased their ships second-hand and frequently kept older vessels in operation for decades, opting time and again to refit and repair their aging liners rather than commission new ones. This meant that their fleet only barely met the minimum safety requirements at the time. The city of Rio was built before double bottoms and watertight compartments became a common safety feature. Her lower deck was dominated by large, uninterrupted cargo spaces with nothing in place to stop the flooding if the ship was ever breached. This left her especially vulnerable as they navigated the unforgiving waters at the entrance of San Francisco Bay. In 1883, William Ward joined the Pacific Mail Steamship Company as an apprentice captain on the city of Rio. Born in Raleigh, North Carolina, Ward was elevated to captain in 1897. During his years in command, he quickly gained a reputation as a cautious navigator who didn't take chances with his ship. By 1901, the charismatic 38-year-old captain excelled at the social aspects of the job. He was an excellent host at the captain's table, and first-class travelers frequently choose the Rio over other options just to enjoy his company. The city of Rio departed for the United States on Tuesday, January 19, 1901. She had approximately 220 passengers and crew on board. While Pacific Mail Steamship Company liners were once filled with Chinese migrants, the Chinese Exclusion Act barred nearly all Chinese immigration by 1901, and most of the Asian passengers on board were on academic or cultural scholarships. Many were just passing through the United States on their way to Europe. Steerage on board was still divided racially, with white and European travelers in one section and Asian travelers in another, lower section. The most high-profile person on board was Hour Fogbound, the U.S. Consul General in Hong Kong. He was traveling with his wife Letitia, their 2 children, and their maid. They were traveling to Washington, D.C., to take part in the inauguration of William McKinley. The long voyage was uneventful. As they approached San Francisco Bay, they were met with a heavy bank of fog, but this was nothing out of the ordinary. The anchors were dropped to wait for the fog to clear, and at 5 p.m. on Thursday, February 21, 1901, harbor pilot Frederick W. Jordan boarded to guide the ship into the bay. With over 24 years of experience guiding ships across the bar, Jordan never suffered a single mishap. Multiple passengers and crew members later reported that Captain Ward had no interest in taking any chances, and was prepared to wait out the fog, no matter how long it took. It was very normal in those days for ships to wait hours, or even days to cross the notoriously treacherous Golden Gate. But at dinner that night at the captain's table, Kate West, a Red Cross nurse who was traveling home after taking a patient to Hong Kong, remembered both the Consul General and Mrs. Wildman expressing their frustration to the captain, telling him that the delay was greatly interfering with their plans. They were afraid that they would miss the president's inauguration. Whether the pressure from the well-connected family had any influence over the captain will never be known. What happened the next morning is not entirely clear, but at 4 a.m., Second Officer Graham Coghlan called harbor pilot Jordan and Captain Ward to the bridge, due to a change in the weather. Jordan had previously asked that he be called first, and as soon as he arrived on the bridge, he ordered First Officer C. J. Johnson to raise the anchors. But as soon as they were lifted out of the water, the thick fog descended once again. Jordan then left the bridge, maybe to conference with the captain. When he returned, he gave the order to finish heaving the anchors and start the engines. Captain Ward only stepped on the bridge for the first time that morning a few minutes later, still in his nightclothes. It's unclear who was in charge at that moment, the captain or the harbor pilot, but the quartermaster was given a course and the engine room was signaled to proceed at half speed. As the ship moved forward, lookout Frederick Lindstrom could see nothing but a wall of fog. Suddenly, he saw the flash of a red and white light just off the ship's bow. He later said, "I felt my heart stand still. I knew what was coming." The city of Rio de Janeiro slammed into the reef at the south side of the Narrows at 5:30 am on Friday, February 22, 1901. The people on board, most of them still asleep, would have only minutes to escape the doomed liner. In the first moments just after the collision, few people on board realized the severity of the situation. The ship's carpenter, Frank Camp, was assisting with raising the anchors, and was just finishing stowing the cables when the ship struck the rocks. After going below to assess the damage, it was clear to him that the ship would go under in only a few minutes. He raced to the bridge to report to the captain that there was already 10 feet of water in the forward hold and 20 feet amidship. The collision ripped through the starboard forward quarter of the ship's hull, as far back as her boiler room. They were now perched precariously on a rocky ledge at Fort Point, giving a false initial sense of stability. But as her stern filled with water, she was in danger of slipping off the ledge into deeper water at any moment. Reports on Captain Ward's actions after the collision vary widely. One witness claimed that the captain immediately went to his cabin and locked the door, but most said that while he seemed stunned by the situation, he took an active role in the evacuation. Even after the collision, it remains unclear what orders came from Captain Ward and which came from Jordan, the harbor pilot. As soon as Camp reported the extent of the damage, the order was given to launch the lifeboats. Captain Ward let out a distress signal with the ship's whistle. He tied it down to let out a continuous blast that would last until the ship went under. There were dozens of ships and small fishing craft in the area, but with the low visibility, the blast from the whistle was critical in attracting attention to the unfolding disaster. It was clear to passengers that something bad happened, but few realized the severity of the situation. Several were still asleep or only just waking up. Many of the survivors were those who were already awake and up top when the collision occurred. Kate West was already up and getting dressed when the liner struck. She described a terrible concussion when they hit and said it felt like the whole vessel was going to pieces. Steerage steward Harry Donahue was also awake and getting dressed when he felt a heavy jar and the ship trembling beneath his feet. Others, like freight clerk George Inglehart, felt only a dull thump. He figured they must have hit something, but he didn't think it was a cause for concern. Still, he awoke the pursuer, who was berthed next door, and then proceeded to dress in his full uniform, without any rush. Passenger William Brandon Jr. was also asleep in his cabin, but he was awoken by the collision. Startled by the violent jolt, he raced topside, still in his night clothes, but a crew member told him that they had just grounded and that it was nothing serious. This reflected the lack of a unified response to the emergency by the ship's crew. During the later inquiry, it was revealed that lifeboat drills were rare and not taken seriously. Almost no crew member reported ever practicing preparing or lowering the boats before that morning. To save money, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company would hire Chinese workers for low-skill positions on the ship. Because of this, most of the ship's seamen did not speak any English, and a single bilingual bosun was used to translate orders. In the confusion, this made it almost impossible to quickly issue orders to the crew. Anti-Asian sentiments at the time were incredibly strong. After the disaster, the Chinese crew members were unfairly blamed for the high loss of life. It's clear that language barriers added to the confusion on board, but Second Officer Graham Coghlan later testified that once the orders were understood, the Chinese crew obeyed them with promptness and courage. The general lack of training and preparedness from the crew as a whole was certainly not the fault of a handful of low-wage deckhands. The initial moments of calm didn't last long. After only a few moments, the ship's electric lights cut out. In the darkness, the ship descended into a confused panic as the ship lost stability, and people realized that they only had a few moments left to escape. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Arthur A. O'Neill, slept through the collision entirely. He was charged with Lifeboat No. 9, which was designated for the Consul General and his family. After he was awoken by a quartermaster, he quickly dressed and was met by Jordan, who ordered him to launch the lifeboat. Dr. O'Neill, a quartermaster, and a few deckhands began launching the boat, but it quickly slipped on the falls, sending the stern into the water. First-class passengers Enji Yamada, a Japanese painter who was on his way to study in New York, had just gone up to see the ship enter the harbor when she struck. When the lights went out, he found himself overwhelmed by the confusion on board. He tried to go below deck, but was pushed back up by the panicking crowd. Seamstress Frances Ripley was traveling in steerage with her father. While he slept, she went on deck early to watch the ship pass through Golden Gate. As the ship descended into chaos, she managed to remain calm. It occurred to her that some of the women still below might need help. In the confusion, she found Nurse Kate West, who she described as bewildered and frightened. Thinking fast, Ripley grabbed West and pushed her up on deck. Realizing that neither of them had a life preserver, Ripley raced back below and quickly returned with one for each of them. Just as they secured their life preservers, freight clerk George Inglehart, who was assigned to Lifeboat No. 10, spotted the two and pushed them into the boat. Commanded by Frank Camp, the small boat was launched just as the Rio turned over onto her side and made her final plunge. Camp cried out, "For God's sake, shove off. She's sinking." As an explosion inside the ship sent shrapnel flying at the boat. They rowed as hard as they possibly could, just barely missing masts and rigging that went smashing into the water all around them, destroying another nearby boat. Kate West recalled that their salvation was due to the heroic, almost superhuman efforts made by those who rowed the boat clear of the wreck. There were others who maintained a cool head after the collision. Steerage steward Harry Donahue immediately reported to the captain for orders after the collision, and he was told to get passengers on deck. He went below and helped 58 passengers escape the depths of the ship. The racial divisions in steerage left many of the Asian passengers to fend for themselves. 37 Asian steerage passengers lost their lives. Only 9 survived. Donahue helped load passengers into the boats as the ship dropped out beneath him. He climbed the rigging but soon found himself in the water. He floated for around 15 minutes before being picked up by lifeboat number 10. With their designated lifeboat, commanded by Dr. O'Neill, unusable, the Wildman family was taken to the boat charged to Third Officer Charles Holland. Harbour pilot Frederick Jordan personally escorted them to the boat, which was already lowered. They had to climb down a rope ladder into the small boat and Mrs. Wildman was afraid to leave the ship and proceeded down the ladder very slowly. As Jordan was carrying one of the children down the ladder, the ship made its final plunge, throwing all of them into the water. The boat they were loading into was violently smashed in two when the Rio turned over, sending her aftermast flinging through the boat as it crashed into the water. Jordan resurfaced and was able to cling to some wreckage before being picked up. He never saw the Wildman family again. Third Officer Holland also somehow managed to survive. Ironically, Dr. O'Neill's lifeboat was righted and successfully launched. They were picked up by another ship a few minutes later. Zenji Yamada didn't have time to find a boat before the ship turned over and threw him into the water. He was stunned for a moment, but soon regained consciousness and swam to the surface, where he soon found a raft with 4 other men on it. The raft drifted for around 20 minutes before they were picked up by one of the lifeboats. The end came suddenly and violently for the Rio, catching many off guard. As soon as the ship's stern filled with water, it dislodged the ship from the rocks. Free from the perch, the ship immediately capsized and sank. Her final moments were absolute chaos and accounts differ, but the city of Rio likely sank in only around 20 minutes. Later that morning, M.J. Fitzgerald, an employee at the Merchants Exchange in San Francisco, was waiting for news of the long-overdue city of Rio. He figured that the ship was just waiting out the fog when he saw a fishing boat approach the wharf towing a lifeboat with the letters City of Rio de Janeiro on its bow. The survivors were picked up by nearby ships, mostly local fishermen. Of the 220 or so people on board, only 85 survived. It was the deadliest disaster in the San Francisco area until the Great Earthquake of 1906, only a few years later. Kate West and Frances Ripley were 2 of only 3 women to survive, along with Gabrielle Larahen. When asked by reporters why so few women survived, Frances Ripley observed that men always managed to take care of themselves. The crew at the Fort Point life-saving station only officially became aware of the disaster when they got the call from Fitzgerald at the Merchants Exchange at 7:40 that morning, nearly 2 hours after the accident that unfolded less than a mile from the station. While lookout Mark Ellingson later claimed that he didn't hear anything, testimony from Private Harry Taylor and other sentries on duty at the time at the nearby Fort Point barracks contradicted his testimony, proving that the Rio's distress whistle was audible on land. The life-saving service was heavily criticized for failing to act. With so many conflicting reports, it was difficult to assign blame for the disaster. Harbour pilot Jordan claimed that Captain Ward pressured them to get underway as soon as possible, but this went against numerous other witnesses, who reported that the captain was in no rush, and many believed Jordan was at fault. Captain Ward died in the sinking, so he was unable to account for his actions. Today, most residents of San Francisco probably haven't heard of the city of Rio. The lives on board are just another footnote in history. Something you might read about on plaque by the sea and forget about by the time you get back in your car. But for the people on board, their hopes and dreams, their fears and anxieties, all came to a sudden end that day, right where the base of one of the most famous landmarks in the world towers over the water, defying the forces that claimed so many lives, daring us to believe we will live forever. Our story may have ended, but the mysteries of the SS Columbia await. Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe.